Okie dokie, back for another stream. So, let's spend a little bit of time talking about what I want to do today. So, nothing too crazy, but something that needs to be done. Right now, we have this UI kind of put together. You know, things are kind of pretty slick. I guess this animation isn't fully working right now. Let's do a little bit of a refresh here. Okay, yeah, so things are looking pretty good. You know, we can bring up this payment form, try and submit this data, stuff like that. The problem is, you might not have noticed, but up until now, all this data is actually just like static example data that's not even coming from the Laravel app. It's just kind of baked into the view component. So if we head over to Sublime, this is our new sponsorship page component, which is this whole page right now. You can see down at the bottom, these sponsorable slots are just these, you know, fake made up JavaScript objects. We're not actually like seeding this with real data from the system. So the first thing that I want to do today is change that. So I want to make sure that we're getting this stuff actually passed back from the controller, you know, from the database, getting it using real data in the system so that we can start testing the UI with real data a little bit more, drive out some error handling scenarios, stuff like that. So let's take a look at the Blade file where we're actually rendering this component. So if we look at sponsorships new, you can see right now we just have this new sponsorship page tag. We're not passing any props or anything, right? So in a perfect world, what I would want to be able to do here is do something like sponsorable slots equals, and then pass through some sponsorable slots from the controller. And I mean, this will happen automatically. In Laravel, if you try to stringify like an eloquent collection, it'll call to JSON on it automatically. But in our case, I kind of want to be explicit about it. It's just kind of nice to see exactly what's going on, so you're not relying on as much magic. So, of course, this isn't going to work right now. If we made that change here, then went over to this new sponsorship page, kind of cleared out the selected slots, kind of got rid of the sponsorable slots data here, and accepted that as a prop, you'll see that when we refresh the page, it looks like we're getting some data, but you know what the problem is here is I have tested out some of this stuff behind the scenes. So we're going to have to try this again. You'll see that when we refresh the page, actually it doesn't even show up because there is no Full Stack Radio podcast. And if we open up SQL Pro and I grab the sponsorship database here, say we were going to just add this in, right? So say we added Full Stack Radio, give it a slug of Full Stack Radio, and say we added like an episode. So I'll have a sponsorable ID of 1, no sponsorship, maybe a price of $500, and maybe a date of like, let's say 2018-07-04, something like that. And we'll give it some timestamps just so that things are what they should be. Maybe we'll duplicate that, have 3 of those at different prices and with different publish dates. So maybe this one will be like 2 weeks later. So I guess that would be like the 28th. And then 2 weeks after that, nobody knows off the top of their head exactly what date that would be. So why don't we just say something like, I don't know, August 11th. It's probably pretty close. Okay, so now if we refresh this, we do get this screen, but you can see we're showing the price, we're showing the dates, but we're not able to see the image or the podcast title or any of that stuff. So there's obviously some data that's not getting passed through here, some data that's null. So how can we drive that out? Well, we could just go and try and just do it and refresh the UI and make sure things are working. But I think maybe a better approach would be to write some tests for what we expect to see when we convert a sponsorable slot to JSON. So to do that, first I'm going to back out some changes here for a second, just so we can copy this data structure and use it as a reference. All right, so if we head over to tests unit, you'll see we have unit tests for a sponsorable, which is like a podcast, but not for a slot. So let's create a new test file. So we'll say artisan make test sponsorable slot test dash dash unit, because it's a unit test. And let's get rid of this comment and this test. Scaffold out a new test here, and we'll just test converting to an array, converting to JSON. So why don't we paste this in? It doesn't keep our comments, eh? Okay. We'll paste this in for reference. We'll comment it out so we can see it. And let's just think about how we want it to work. So we need an assertion to make sure that when we convert a slot to JSON, we get some structure like this. So let's write that assertion. We could do something like this, assert. Well, let's see, actually. If we look for assert JSON, so it looks like there's a bunch of PHP unit assertions that we could use. So assert JSON string equals JSON string. And it looks like all it does is make sure that both strings are valid JSON and then check that they're equal. But it probably is the most correct one to use. So let's do assert JSON string equals JSON string. Then we'll pass through the expected JSON string. So to create that, we're going to have to call JSON encode and pass through some data. In this case, it's basically going to be this data here, right? And obviously this isn't PHP syntax, so we'll have to clean that up a little bit. That one, not that one, that one, that one. And wrap those in quotes. And we want to make sure that that ends up being equal to whatever we get when we take some sponsorable slot and convert it to JSON. Rules for splitting tests into new files. So stuff in my unit test folder is usually mapping to a single class. So I'll have a test per class. For feature tests, it's usually like a test per endpoint. But sometimes I'll have two endpoints in the same test. If it's like the get request of a form and the post request, sometimes I'll put those in the same test. But if there's a lot of cases to handle, I'll often split those out. Okay, so this is kind of what we're hoping to see. So now we have to do kind of our setup phase, right? Like where are we going to get this sponsorable slot from? So let's say we did sponsorable slot equals. Now I'm not going to use a factory for this because I don't think it's a good idea to use factories for these sorts of tests because we want to create it exactly the way that we want. Factories are going to set some defaults and stuff for us. So when I'm unit testing individual models, I'm usually just creating them full on. Sometimes with factories if I'm testing like a more behavioral method, but for stuff like this where we're testing how it converts to another data structure, I think it's probably best to be explicit about the full structure. Okay, so let's try and create it and think about how we want it to work. So I think it's basically just going to be this exact same data, but maybe a change here and there. So the one change I would want to make is I don't want to just store the date as a string. We probably want to store that as like a carbon instance. So let's pull in carbon and we'll just say carbon parse this because we want this to be like an actual date object. But other than that, I think that's probably totally fine. So let's just go ahead and run this test and see what we get. No sponsorable slot class, so let's pull that in, run the test again. No such table, sponsorable slots, so let's use our refresh database trait, run the test again. Sponsorable slots has no column named title. So this is where things get interesting. So up until this point, none of our existing tests have actually forced there to be a title for sponsorable slots. So if we go to the create sponsorable slots table, you can see all we have is the sponsorable ID. We have the sponsorship ID for if it's been sponsored or not. And then we have a price and a publish date. So I think we can just add a string here for the title. And that should get us a little bit closer. So let's run this again. Sponsorable slots has no column named image URL. So let's do that same thing. It can also be a string. So I'll add image URL. And that's not a test. This is a test. Not null constraint failed. So the sponsorable ID has to exist. So we have to make sure that we actually create a sponsorable for this to be attached to. So I'm happy to use a factory for that. So let's just say factory sponsorable class create. And then here we can say sponsorable ID equals sponsorable get key. So if we run this again, okay, now we're going to make sure we pull in that. Run it again, integrity constraint violation, sponsораbles.slug. Okay, so our factory isn't creating a slug for the sponsorable. So let's head over to the model factory. And here where we're creating a sponsorable, let's make sure that we also create a slug for that sponsorable. Let's run this again. Okay, so now we're failing to assert that the JSON matched. And let's see, what actually is different here? It's saying that the image says didn't match, but they certainly look the same. So I think it's just the fact that the publish date is a string. Well, we want it to be a string, but we're getting back the carbon instance kind of stringified. So to fix that, we have to make sure that Laravel is going to convert that publish date to a string for us when we try and convert this thing to JSON. So the easiest way to do that, there might be two ways to do it. One way to do it, I'm curious if this works. If we just say protected casts equals, and we say that the publish date is a date, I'm curious if that'll just do it automatically. So that doesn't quite do it. That gives us a time and a date. So it's one step closer though. So I think what we'll do though is we might need this later, but let's not rely on it if we don't need it for the tests. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to override the toArray method. And this is where we can control the JSON kind of structure and make it exactly what we want. So I actually do this a lot. Like a lot of people will use like Laravel's things like, I don't even know what they're called, like hidden and visible or something like that. To control what shows up in the JSON. To me, that's just seems like an unnecessary abstraction. I would rather just say, okay, this is the exact structure that I want to return when it gets converted to an array. And since we only need one representation of it right now, I think it's perfectly fine to do it here. If we ever needed it in multiple formats, maybe you'd use a presenter or something, but for now, this is totally going to be fine. So why don't we start by basically just copying this, pasting it in here, and then just replacing the stuff on the right-hand side. So we'll just do this ID, this sponsorable ID. Now this might seem like a little bit redundant since Laravel does some of this stuff for you automatically anyways, but I kind of like it personally. So we'll do this publish date. And since it's a carbon instance, we want to format it. So we'll format it as YMD. We'll get this price from the database and this image URL. All right, so I think we're going to have a failing test because we commented at this cast, and I think we'll need to bring that back to get it working. Okay, so actually we're not expecting the sponsorable ID. So we could return that. Let's think. Do we actually care if we return it? I mean, let's return it. Why not? Let's add that to our test. Let's say that we do want to include the sponsorable ID. Seems fine. Okay, so what do we get now? Okay, so now it's passing. So it seems like it doesn't depend on the cast, which I find kind of interesting. I'm guessing that's because we're creating this model with the carbon instance, referencing it again down here, and it's not fetching it back from the database. So it's keeping publish date as a carbon instance, even though it's not being cast. So something that is probably a good idea is to make sure that we're looking at a fresh version of it from the database so we know that it's been through Laravel's whole kind of like hydration cycle. So let's run the test again, and it's probably going to fail now. I'll call the member function format on string. So that's what I was expecting. So publish date is a string when it comes back from the database unless we cast it to a date. So if we cast it to a date and run this again, now price is coming back as a string, and we want it to be an integer, and same with sponsorable ID. So let's set up some casts for that stuff too. So we want to make sure that price comes back as an integer. This is why it's good to do this rehydration cycle. And then the same thing for sponsorable ID, should be an integer. For some reason I thought Laravel did the foreign keys automatically for you, but maybe not. Oh, let's run this again. Okay, so now we're green. I don't think I meant to float. The price is in cents, so we definitely don't want it to. We really do want it to be an integer for the sake of math being accurate. Okay, so if we run the whole test suite, though, we got a bunch of errors because a bunch of places are not creating models with all of their data. So the trick here is just going to be to go through our model factory and make sure that we're providing defaults for this stuff. So if we go to our model factory for our sponsorable slot, the first thing that we want to do is add a title. So we'll just say example podcast episode 1. Let's run the whole test suite again. The next one is it's complaining that there's a missing image URL somewhere. So let's just make sure that we provide a default image. I found this service that kind of does that stuff pretty nicely. It was called like placeholder image service. Which one was it? Place IMG. This one seemed kind of cool. So if we make like a 640 by 640, whoa. Damn, this is a terrible UI. This is painful. 640, okay, geez. You can see it generates like some tech image. So just using this URL. So that way if we reuse our factory for seeders and stuff, we'll be able to like actually see an image. So that's kind of cool. So let's run these again. Okay, so now the whole test suite is green. So that's pretty sweet. And now the one thing is if we go ahead and run artisan migrate fresh seed, we don't actually have any seeders set up, but you'll see, we have to go and like fill in all these new fields and stuff. So if we go to the browser, we're going to get that same problem where this page doesn't exist because we cleaned out that whole thing. So let's set up some seeds maybe. That seems like a decent idea. I'd be curious to know what you guys like about Twitch better than YouTube. For me, like I already have other stuff on YouTube, like my conference talks and that sort of thing. And I want to export everything to YouTube. So it seems like I should just do it all here to begin with. But I'd be curious to know what sort of features you actually like on Twitch that are useful. If it's just the UI, you can go to like gaming.youtube.com and then put in the stream ID and you get like a kind of a nicer one. But yeah. So the chat and the culture I find kind of interesting because, I mean, it's a programming thing, not a gaming stream. So, anyways. Okay. Yeah, let's create a seeder so we can seed some stuff. So right now I've just got an empty database seeder. So let's just set this up to actually create some stuff. So we're going to need a podcast, right? A sponsorable. So let's just do factory, sponsorable, class, create. And we'll probably want to set some specific data for this. So why don't we use what we've been using? So we can say the name of the sponsorable is full stack radio. And the slug will just be a slugified version of that. Okay, next we want to do some slots. So we could do sponsorable slots, save many. And then we can pass through an array of models to save. And we can create those with factory too. So why don't we do something like factory, sponsorable, slot, class. And we'll use make instead of create since this is going to get saved through the relationship. And then we just need to fill out some stuff here too. So what do we need? We need a title. So why don't we just do something like full stack radio episode, like 97. We'll start there or something. Price. So we'll give these all different prices, but we'll start with maybe a $500 one. What else do we need? Image URL and publish date, I think, are the only two. So for image URL, we can just use the same placeholder image. Actually, you know what? Let's use the actual full stack radio image. So we'll just steal from Simplecast for now. And then publish date. The reason I'm doing this all on one line, by the way, is because I want to duplicate this a bunch of times, and it's nicer to duplicate it all on one line. So for the publish date, we can do like carbon. Let's do today, and then we'll add weeks. Maybe we'll do like 2 weeks from today, or maybe we'll start with like, just so we don't have to rerun the seeders very often. Why don't we run like 12 weeks from now? Something like that. Okay, so I think that's going to be a good start. So why don't we make like 4 or 5 total? And let's go ahead and update some of these values. So we'll replace these 97s. I'll use this text pastry plugin. I tweeted about this yesterday. It's a cool plugin that lets you kind of generate numeric sequences. So if I type 98 here, it's going to make the first one 98, then 99, then 100, then 101. That's pretty handy. For price, we'll just kind of mix them up a little bit. Maybe we'll have like 475 and then like 525, something like that. Okay, so then for the publish date, since full stack radio is published every 2 weeks, we'll use text pastry again, and we'll publish the first one 14 weeks from now using increments of 2. Cool. All right, let's run the seeder. Artisan migrate fresh dash seed. Oh, we got a problem, probably a namespace thing. Yeah, let's import this, run it again. Oh, another one. Class carbon not found. Okay. Make sure we pull in Laravel's version of carbon so we're consistent. All right. So now if we check the database, you can see that everything kind of got pulled in and created as expected. So that'll be good enough to get us started. And if we refresh here, hey, we got all the data that we wanted to have in place. So that's pretty cool. So why don't we make a couple commits? I'm always bad about doing this stuff in a responsible way. So I think the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to I'm not going to commit the database seeder. We'll make that a separate one. But all these other things are part of the same commit, really, which is basically just like test sponsorable slots are converted to the right JSON. And then for this commit, we'll just say add basic seed data. I don't know if there's any full open source Laravel and Vue stuff that you can look at. I think I'm going to open source this app. So when I do that, this will be a decent example. But right now, I don't know of any off the top of my head. I don't know how popular Phoenix is going to get, but I like Elixir a lot as a language, and I would like to learn that framework myself too. So, okay, so that's pretty good. There's one other thing actually that this is missing though, which is if you take a look at there's this component complete purchase modal, and right now when you go to actually press the submit button on the form, it just goes to this test endpoint, which is obviously no good, right? We want to send this to the real endpoint, which I think if we look at our routes file is sponsorable/sponsorships. So in this case, it's going to be a post request to full stack radio /sponsorships. So we have to think about, okay, how are we going to actually make that work, right? So there's two general approaches that you could use. One is to just like kind of hard code the route structure into the component and then just kind of fill in the gaps yourself, right? So we could do something like slash, and then we would need to know the sponsorable slug, which we might not actually have access to here. So you can see props, we actually only get selected slots, amount, and open. I'm kind of curious what we use selected slots for here. We pass those through. Okay, so we need to get like the sponsorable passed in, right? And then we could do something like sponsorable dot slug slash sponsorships. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it though is to kind of bake the entire link into the JSON, so that instead of having to construct that URL here, we could just do something like a post request to sponsorable. And what I like to do is like have like a nested links resource. So you could do like sponsorable.links, and then we would just have to come up with like a name for it, right? So we could do it based on like the route name. So in this case, it would be like, this route would be what? Sponsorable sponsorships.store, right? So we could do something like sponsorable.links. You could even nest it all the way under there if you wanted to. You could say like sponsorable slots.store, or you could just call it like, or sorry, sponsorships.store, you know, or we could just say like store sponsorship, which I think is maybe like a good way to go. So why don't we update our tests to include this link so that we can actually make use of it. Then we'll kind of feed that through our kind of component tree and get that working. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo what we had there. I'm going to head back to the sponsorable slot test. And let's just make sure that this result also contains a links key. And in that links key, we get a store sponsorship link. And man, I'm always conflicted about this friggin' underscores stuff. I guess we should be consistent. Store sponsorship. And we'll just make sure that this matches. Where do we get our site URL from here? So it's app URL in the env, which I think is config.app.url, something like that. I mean, we could just also say like URL to slash full stack radio slash sponsorships. Okay, so that link is not present. So let's update our toArray to include a list of links. This is something I used to think was gross back in the day. I used to think it was bad to have a model like generate URLs and stuff, but it's by far the simplest way to do this stuff. Yeah, you can't like dependency inject your URL generator or your route generator, but it's not worth it. It's so much nicer to just be able to just get the link from the model who has all the other information instead of creating a presenter or doing any fancy stuff like that. So let's just add this store sponsorship. I'm conflicted on this name. Part of me wants to make it match like exactly what we would do here, like sponsorable sponsorships.store, or just sponsorships.store, right? And then here we could even do sponsorships.store and just have a dot in the key. But the thing that's kind of sucky about that is when you're accessing that in JavaScript, we'd have to access it like an array instead of like dot notation because it contains the dot. But I don't know. Let's roll with it. So we'll have this return a link to the sponsorable sponsorships.store endpoint where the sponsorable slug is this slug, this sponsorable. This is not even, what are we doing? This isn't even the right file. It's not even the right test either. Okay. Let's go to the sponsorable test, because that's where we actually need to do this. We don't want to add the links key to the slot. We want to add it to the sponsorable. So I'm going to add a new test to the sponsorable, and we'll test converting a sponsorable to JSON as well. Okay. Let's trash all this stuff. Okay, so we're going to have a sponsorable. We're going to create a sponsorable, and we're going to pass some data to the sponsorable. So we'll keep a few things here, but yeah, this will be sponsorable. So a sponsorable has an ID. We'll hard code that in just so that we can make sure that they match instead of letting it be auto-generated. We'll make it full stack radio. Might as well use data that we understand. For the slug, it'll be full stack radio. And hopefully that's all we have to do for now. Okay, so we can't set the ID, so let's go to the sponsorable. And we'll do protected guarded equals empty array. No mass assignment protection, because we just won't do mass assignment. Okay, so we're getting the created at and updated at timestamps, which we're not expecting. So I'm kind of surprised that we can't just check like that the JSON is like a subset of another JSON string, because I mean, is it the end of the world if we pass that data back? But until we actually need it, maybe it's a good idea to only pass back exactly what's actually required. So let's override toArray here as well. We'll do the same sort of thing. So ID is going to be this ID. And what else are we testing for? Right now we're only testing ID and links. So I think it's probably wise to test that we pass back more stuff, because I think we're going to want it eventually. So we'll add that to our test. So let's get the name and the slug. Name, full stack radio, and we'll just duplicate this and bring it down. Oh, what's going on with our indentation here? Where do we get 2 spaces from? Is it because we copied the JavaScript stuff? Probably. Which means I probably have stuff that's violating my style guide here. Bummer. We'll do that as a separate commit. Okay, so let's run this test again. So name and slug. Let's add the slug. Let's run this again. Okay, so we expected the slug, but we didn't get the slug back. That's kind of surprising to me. Oh no, we did get it back. It's just a dumb diff format because of links. Okay, so let's add the links section. So we'll say links, and one of these links is going to be sponsorships.store. And that's going to be route sponsorable sponsorships.store. And it's going to take a sponsorable slug, which is this slug. And this line is kind of too long, so we'll pull that down. Let's add some commas. What do we get now? Okay, sponsorships, sponsorable sponsorships.store is not defined. So let's head over to our routes file. We'll save it. We already added the name. And we'll run it again. And what's our error now? Okay, so the test is not looking for the right thing. Sponsorable or sponsorships.store. Okay, green. So now in our view components, well, first let's just commit that instead of having to do multiple commits here. All right. So this one, we don't want that. So let's discard this. Okay. Let's say test converting sponsораbles to JSON. Seems good. And let's go and fix the indentation in this file. Oh, that didn't work properly. Let's pull it all out, re-indent. That looks pretty good. Looks fine here too. Okay. All right, so fix indentation. Okay, so the next thing I think we should look at is the actual form here now. So ideally we want to be able to do something like this .sponsorable.links at sponsorships.store. And this is what I meant when I said we're going to have to access this using like array syntax because it contains a dot. Yeah, 4 spaces sucks in PHP, but that is the agreed upon standard, so it is what it is. Okay, so this isn't going to work, right? Because we're not actually feeding the sponsorable through. We're not going to see that right away. But we will be able to see it if we actually went and tried to submit it. So just say we wanted to buy these two or whatever, and we just had like example co, add them at example.com, then put in a bunch of 4s and 2s, and then we went to pay. Gonna get an error. Cannot read property links of undefined. So let's make sure that we kind of like pass all that stuff down. So this gets used by, well, actually, let's just define that this needs a prop. So selected slots and sponsorable. Now we could actually just pass in the endpoint, but that's a design decision that I don't think I have enough information to choose between those two options yet. For now, we'll just kind of pass through the models. So the props will also pass through the sponsorable, and this will have to pass that sponsorable down into the modal. And what uses the pay button is the new sponsorship page. So here where we have this pay button, we're going to have to pass through the sponsorable as well. And this is going to need to accept that as a prop too. And now up in our sponsorships new blade file, we're going to want to pass through the sponsorable just like we pass through the slots. I don't actually use view router. We're building this as just like a purely server rendered app that just has like some sprinkling of JavaScript on the front end. So right now, I mean, the layout actually isn't rendering anything. It's only rendering this component, and this component is taking up the full page. So it's kind of like client rendered in that sense. Like there's no server rendered HTML currently, except for like, you know, this is what my server is rendering, right? I'm throwing in the component, view is mounted here. And the idea is the way this is set up, every single page that you hit is going to be served from the server, reinitialize view, that sort of thing. I'd like to experiment with converting this to an SPA at some point. Like right now, it's only got one page, so it wouldn't be a crazy big change to make. But I've never actually built an SPA with Vue, and that's something I'd like to do. And maybe this is a good app to try it on. So that might be a project that we take on with these streams somewhere down the road, because I'd like to do these streams maybe 2 or 3 times a week, basically indefinitely, as just like a way to put out some fun stuff and hang out with people and build some stuff. So I use provide inject with Vue sometimes. I don't think it's a great fit for this situation. I think it's a better fit when you have components that are like super kind of tightly coupled and need to kind of share state, because it's too impractical for the end user otherwise. But in this case, it doesn't feel like it would buy me too much. All right, so if we do the old refresh here and try and buy these again, I wonder what happens. Type in our 4s and 2s. Okay, so now we get a validation error, which is kind of interesting. So let's check out what we actually got. So I think this validation error, now that I see that it's an empty response, is happening. Sponsorships controller. You can see we return a 422 if the payment fails. And I think probably what's happening under the hood is the payment gateway is just not working, because I don't think we've even set one up. So yeah, we use a fake payment gateway, and the fake payment gateway, where's my controller? Sponsorships controller. The fake payment gateway, when we try to charge using the real Stripe token, is saying that the token is invalid, I think is what the problem is. So I'm trying to think like what the best way to get around that temporarily would be. If we look at the fake payment gateway, you can see when it tries to make a charge, it basically checks if the token coming in isn't this like hard-coded temporary token, then it just throws this exception, right? Stripe's tokens are different every time, so we probably want to make sure that if we have some way of telling that it's a Stripe token. Like, I guess what I'm trying to get at is if we want the fake payment gateway to allow this token, as well as any tokens that it recognizes as being from Stripe, because we want to be able to use the same implementation through the UI temporarily anyways, then we have to kind of look at what Stripe's tokens look like and see what the pattern is. I think they all start with like SK dash something. Toke underscore. Okay, so why don't we just like add a line of code to our to this here. If it doesn't equal valid test token or not starts with, starts with hey snack needles. So if it doesn't start with toke underscore, which is basically us saying, okay, it's like a valid Stripe token, then we'll throw the exception. Otherwise, we'll just accept it as a valid token for now. I think ultimately, like, we're going to trash this code anyways, because once we build the real Stripe implementation, which is something that I probably want to tackle next week, we'll be able to use the real Stripe implementation in local development and just hit a Stripe test account with test credentials, which is probably a more realistic kind of end-to-end test of the whole flow anyways. All right, so let's go ahead and try this again. Example co, adam@example.com. See what we get. Okay, let's pay. All right, so we still got an error. So I think we're probably still getting that same error. If token does not equal, you know what? This should be an and. Boolean logic, man. All right, let's see. All right, thanks. We'll be reaching out for your sponsorship information via email soon. So if we head over to the old SQL Pro, we'll see that the 2 episodes that we tried to purchase, which is episodes 97 and 98, those are successfully marked as sponsored. In the sponsorships table, we have a sponsorship, which was my email, my fake company, and the amount that I paid for the sponsorship. And yeah, so it looks like everything kind of worked from that perspective. Now we will have some other issues, which is something I want to tackle on the next stream too, which is that if we try to pay, so the credit card one, that's going to complain. It looks like we're also getting can read property ID of undefined. So basically we haven't properly driven out any of these error handling flows yet. So all the server error handling is there, making sure that the fields are passed through and stuff. But we're not doing anything properly on the client side to handle it. So you can see that right now we got an error coming back. The given data was invalid. Email field is required. Company name is required. And we didn't pass those through. And our view component is just ignoring that and not doing anything with it. So I think maybe this will be a good time to cut this stream off, because we've gone about 45 minutes and we kind of tackled what we wanted to tackle in terms of getting all the real data in there and getting this kind of being fed from the database instead of just a fake view component data. And then in the next stream, which will probably be next week, like I don't know, maybe we'll do on Monday, we'll work on this error handling stuff so we can start figuring out how we want to style things and showing error messages and stuff like that. And then we'll probably work on the actual Stripe stuff. So yeah, that's where we're going to cut it off for today. Thanks everyone for checking out the stream. I'm probably going to open source this code base next week. Why not? So people can check it out and play around with it. And I'll hopefully see you on Monday for the next stream. Thanks everyone. See ya.